Welcome to the IGEOS show, where we help grow the passion for an extraordinary workplace. If you're listening to or watching this, we hope to strengthen your passion for a workplace that has the potential not only to have an extraordinary impact on your life, but also on the world. My name is Amit Riker, and my co-hosts are Valerio Pascotto and Timothy Gallwey. Now to you, Valerio.
Thank you, Amit. What drives our efforts is really a vision and credo to enrich humaneness in the workplace. For that, we interview thought leaders who have been inspired by values of compassion, empathy, and modeling to share their discoveries, challenges, and successes. Really, there is no time like now to change the tide, from hateful divisiveness to seeking similarities, from the myth of the genius to the wisdom of humankind, and from the fears of the primitive brain to the wonder of generosity and warmth.
To support you in this work of creating extraordinary workplaces, we would like to offer you a free worksheet you can download on the 5 disciplines of a high-performance team. Just go to IGEOS.net to download the sheet and learn more about us. And now, on to our guest for today. Good morning, conscious leaders, conscious teams. Very excited for a very special guest today, Tony Schwartz. He is here with us today to share some of his wisdom, and we're going to get into some exciting things today. So just for those of you who may not know who Tony is the CEO and founder of the Energy Project, a consulting firm that helps individuals and organizations solve intractable problems and add more value in the world by widening their worldview. And he is considered one of the world's thought leaders around sustainable high performance and building more human workplaces. What you may know particularly about Tony is he's the author of several books, including The Powerful Engagement. This is one of my copies from many, many years ago, and which he co-wrote with Jim Loehr. Spent 28 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. And then also his most recent book, The Way We're Working Isn't Working, a New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller. Tony, such a pleasure to have you. Welcome, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I was so thrilled to have the chance to meet you at the Work Human Conference in Austin. I've followed your work for many years, and so it's truly an honor to be able to speak with you today and get to meet you and then find that we have this common world of Tim Gallwey in the inner game. So such a delight.
Likewise.
I want to ask you, since I got to hear a little bit of your story already, but tell us how you first discovered Tim and his work, The Inner Game of Tennis.
Yeah, I was 22 years old, so it was more than 40 years ago, I'm sorry to say. And I had already been interested. You would think that the reason I was initially drawn to Tim Gallwey would be tennis, and I would say it was, but I was also a seeker. I was a seeker from as early as I can remember, and I was always interested in what makes it possible to, I have some fancier words today. At the time, I think it would have just been, I'm a kid, I'm not very happy, I grew up in a difficult family, and what could make me feel better, or how could I be happier? But what made me a seeker was that I knew that it was something inside that I needed to understand or reckon with in a different way. And so I had that draw from a very, very early age. And the first job I got as a journalist out of college was writing for a magazine that was that is long since defunct, but was called New Times. And I got an assignment to write a piece about Tim just after The Inner Game of Tennis came out. I think it was starting to be a bit of a sensation already, but it was very, very close to when he wrote it. And I was, in addition to being a seeker, a tennis player with pretty good skills and bad head. I was a terrible competitor, and the idea that there might be some magical solution in my psyche or my soul was incredibly appealing to me. So I was also, in addition to being a seeker, a tennis player. I played, club tennis and high school tennis, and I had pretty good skills, and I was a terrible competitor. I was a head case. I was a choker. The bigger the match, the more tense I was, which probably isn't unheard of, but I didn't get over it. Like, I got into the match tense, and I was tense in the middle of the match, and I was tense at the end of the match. So to me, this was the elixir, this idea that this guy had, could give you a method to managing the way you were feeling while you were playing, just made all kinds of sense to me. And it was, I didn't at that point understand that Tim had a spiritual life of his own, and that this fit into a kind of larger vision that he had about what it means to be a human being and so on. But I certainly could sense it in the book. And so I went out to do this piece with him, and I had, I probably spent a total of 3 or 4 days following him around and interviewing him, and finally playing a tennis match with him, in which at the end of that match, it was a very close match, and I was playing out of my head, as they sometimes say. I was playing like real inner game tennis, with the presence of the guru right there. And he was on the other side. He was, it was doubles, and we were playing against him. And at the very end of the match, he was serving for the match. I was playing the ad court, backhand court, and he could have run out the match. And I had like 2 or 3 ad points against us, match points against us, and I hit 2 or 3 of what probably remain the best shots I've ever hit off of my backhand to either pass them at net or cause an error. And it was sort of the high moment of my life. And if it had only ended then, I would remember it with 100% pure joy. As it happened, we got to 5-5, and they ran out the match 7-5. But, I walked away from that experience. Actually, I remember now that I went back after. Now I'm realizing that I read The Inner Game probably a year before I actually wrote about Tim, and I was still in college. And I got so into it that I thought of taking a semester off just to play tennis. I didn't do it, but that's how much it affected me. And so I think that whole perspective I brought into my work almost immediately. And as you know, my life has been about kind of a parallel path to Tim's around human development, adult development, understanding, seeing more, understanding the possible, releasing, seeing through blind spots, just understanding what does it take to be a fully functioning human being, and tap into more of who you're capable of being. That's the kind of big umbrella that has guided the last 25 years of my life. The first half of my life was as a journalist, and it was during that time that I wrote a book called What Really Matters: Searching for Wisdom in America, and really got deeply into understanding kind of the evolution of the consciousness movement from about 1960 through what was then 1995, during which, or the human potential movement, during which an awful lot of interesting people were working, and I went and did the work of a whole bunch of different people and interviewed them and wrote this book about them. And as I think about it, Tim Gallwey, I have a little piece in the book that is about either my experience with him or about his work.
Oh, that's beautiful. Beautiful. Let's fast forward to present day and the amazing work that you're doing with the Energy Project. Could you tell us a little bit about basically the arc for when you first wrote The Powerful Engagement to the way we're working isn't working? Tell us about that journey and how that's been for you.
So after I wrote What Really Matters, was published in 1995, I was at a point in my journalism career where I thought, this profession is in a lot of trouble. This is the beginning of the internet. It's really hard to make a living. And most important, I don't feel that most of the time, that book was an exception, but most of the time, the work I'm doing is adding the kind of value in the world that I feel compelled to add. And so I was looking for another gig. And the irony is that it ended up being with another person in the world of tennis. The Powerful Engagement is a book I wrote with this guy, Jim Loehr. And Jim was someone I'd written about in What Really Matters, who certainly didn't bring the sort of spiritual human evolution perspective to the work he did with tennis players. But what he did do was to understand that what was going on inside these players was as important as their skills. And that when their games broke down, often a technical solution didn't work. They changed their stroke, they can do a different kind of conditioning. It wouldn't change their circumstance. And what he would do is try to interpret it through the lens of energy. Specifically, how are you managing your energy? Physically, what's the relationship between your energy expenditure and your energy recovery or renewal, between work and rest? How much are you sleeping? What are you eating? Then emotionally, that part of it wasn't very well worked out at that point, but certainly he was aware that how you feel and a specific way that you need to feel is critical to high performance. And that way of feeling, in simple terms, is just what we call high positive energy. If you ask people how they feel when they're at their best or when they're performing at their best, they always will tell you the same set of 10 or 15 adjectives. I'm excited, engaged, passionate, energized, focused, in the moment, all of those kinds of things. And you'll never hear anybody say, "Oh, I'm at my best when I'm feeling in a rage, or when I'm feeling really anxious, or when I'm unmotivated." It just doesn't happen. And as obvious as that is, what was fascinating was, well, what if you could consciously cultivate this performance state that you need to be in, as opposed to just find your way occasionally in that state? Not that different even than the flow state that Csikszentmihalyi talks about, which, when he talks about it, is not something that he really gives you much sense of how to cultivate. He really just describes what it is, and it's very, very appealing and seductive. So in any case, Jim's doing this work, and it's around the physical, the emotional, the mental. How do you manage your attention? And finally, the spiritual, which in the framework he was using, actually wasn't using a framework. I brought that to it, because skipping forward, Jim and I were friends, and about a year after I finished, or 2 years after I finished What Really Matters, I was visiting him, playing tennis, hanging out. And he was saying to me, I've been working with all these professional athletes and I'm getting tired of it. And, they're self-absorbed and they're full of themselves and they don't pay very promptly. And I'm thinking maybe I should try to figure out a way to take this into the business world. And actually, I've got a chance to give a little lecture. And if you want to tag along, I'm talking to a bunch of businessmen this afternoon. So I went along. And what I took out of that was that there was something really compelling that I could imagine would be of value to people in the business world, to leaders, to executives, with whom I'd had a lot of experience as a journalist. I'd covered business for many years. I knew a lot about the mind of a leader. But I thought the language that he was using, which was very much athletic language, probably wasn't going to cut it in business world. And so I basically said to him, hey, what if I, spend a month with you or 2 months or some amount of time and try to help you come up with the language to build this into a program that you could sell to the business world? And he said, yeah, great. So, a month or two turned into 5 years. And we built out a whole program that we began to deliver. It was both on site in Orlando, Florida, where he had a bunch of tennis courts and a training facility, but it was also out on the road with companies that would bring us in. And then together, or I should say, I wrote, and he obviously brought a lot of the ideas to a book that we did to the book that you showed, that we did together in 2003 called The Power of Full Engagement, Managing Energy, Not Time. And that really put us on the map, both of us, because we had the unbelievable good fortune to get on Oprah. When Oprah was still Oprah. Not that she isn't, but you can't sell a book as effectively by getting Oprah to pay attention to it in 2018 as you could in 2003. And when Oprah held a book up on the screen and said, read this book, you went to number one, literally. And we went to number one in 4 hours after that show. Wow. From 10,000 on Amazon. It was also very close to the last time I ever spoke with Jim Loehr. Apparently, he had been harboring unhappiness about the way our relationship was unfolding, and it was clearly not a situation in which both of us could run the company, and truly I had as much desire to run it as he did. And so in 2003, we split and I founded the Energy Project. And the Energy Project is now 16 years old and has been a fantastic and exciting story and experience. And we've worked and continue to work with many of the biggest and most prestigious companies in the world. We took 20,000 people at Google through our work. And we've now taken probably another several thousand at Facebook. We've worked at, probably a dozen of the top 50 companies in the world. We've done all kinds of work at both the individual level and at the organizational level to, as you said in my bio, really create more human workplaces. But to do this in a very, very concrete way, as opposed to, just be nicer to people. We've tried to really use the science of high performance, in some ways, subversively, meaning I was interested in the evolution of human beings in those organizations and continue to be interested in that. But what they buy is you will help us to get those employees to be more productive and our company to perform better. And that was fine. I mean, but over the years, I've come out of the closet more and been more explicit about what I think the work is really about and why I think that serves organizations well.
That's fantastic. I couldn't agree 100% more. That is definitely the work that Tim and Valerio have been doing through the work of IGEOS, that at the end of the day, we're human beings, and we have to be able to cultivate that aspect of ourselves in order to perform at our best. And it's been really amazing to see the work that you've been doing with the Energy Project and in that realm. I know we have just a little bit limited time here, and so much more amazing stuff to talk about. But maybe one of the things that we could hear is this idea. What I really loved about how you evolved some of the ideas in your most recent book, this idea about opposites. And let me see if I can say this correctly, anacaluthia, this idea of mutual entailment of virtues. So why is that important? Why should we know about that, Tony?
Yeah, so that's a Stoic concept, anacaluthia, the mutual entailment of the virtues. And I first heard about it in a book by Michael Murphy, the founder of the Esalen Institute. And it was a book called The Future of the Body. So here's the thing. We live in what I think almost all of us would agree is a vastly more complex world than we did 10, 20, and certainly 30 and 40 years ago. And the complexity of our thinking has not kept pace with the complexity of the problems we're meant to solve. And so the worldviews, the sort of basic worldviews that predominate especially in the West today, are one of the things they have in common is that they're somewhat binary in their perspective, meaning, in simple terms, they believe that the view that they embrace is the right view. And not unlike fundamentalist religions, that this is the right view and everything else is the wrong view, that an opposite is always divided between good and bad, or right and wrong, or winning and losing. And in this world we live in, there are very, very few challenges and problems that can be solved through that binary lens. The real challenges we face, you think about it, global warming, water shortages, the nuclear threat, even authoritarianism as a spreading phenomenon, that threatens democracy. And then the whole disruptive nature of technology for most organizations. The way of thinking that prevails across most businesses and organizations, a reflection of what I would call modernism or post-Enlightenment thinking, grounded in science, measurable. What you see is what's real. If you can't see it, it's not real. It's just insufficient. So, one of the very core opposites that we all contend with is, or even if we don't contend with, they exist, is the internal world and the external world. But post-Enlightenment, which is now several hundred years, the overwhelming emphasis has been on the external world at the expense of even noticing the internal world. Now, that's not true for you and all the people who will be listening to this. These are people who have recognized the value and importance of the inner world for a long time. So I'm not saying nobody does. But what tends to happen is the people who give value to the external world tend to disparage and diminish the interior world. It's touchy-feely, it's soft, it's subjective, it's kind of icky, and quite honestly, though most people don't say this, it's scary. And at the same time, as I discovered doing what really matters, the the people who value and focus on and prioritize their inner world often find it hard to pay as much attention to and value equally their outer world. Mm. They tend to disparage the idea of a lot of the traditional ideas around achievement and ambition and money and accomplishment and so on. And the notion of a more complex worldview, the work that I have now found at the center of my life and my organization's life, is marrying these often opposing points of view or perspectives. So one of them is inner life and outer life, because one of the things I can tell you pretty confidently is that what's going on in your inner life is what enables your outer life. I mean, if you do not, there are all kinds of blocks in the system that arise in the course of our lives and our conditioning that stand in the way of the full expression of what we're capable of in the outer life. So if you don't pay attention to those, you're not going to have the kind of outer life that you're capable of. And if you don't make the outer life important, you are not in the game. If you're not somebody who wants to live, on a mountain in a meditative pose as your life, which is most people, I mean, that's not disrespecting those who do it, but most of us want to live in some way in the world. I feel you have an obligation for all you've been given, particularly those who've been given a lot, to act in the external world, to make a difference, to add value. And one of the ways we talk about this is that to the degree that you are defending your own value because you haven't dealt with your interior world, that's a zero-sum game. And whatever energy you're expending defending your value is energy not available to create value. Mm. Just to take it one step broader, one of the things we came to understand, and to be honest, we kind of happened on this in the course of our work, is that, and this is an anti-Kaluthia concept, anti-Kaluthia, that I began to see the evidence of in practice in individuals and in organizations, is that any virtue or strength that you overuse becomes a liability. So the very thing that gets you the best stuff, when you double down on it and overuse it, it suddenly becomes toxic. So honesty overused becomes cruelty. And confidence overused becomes arrogance. And courage overused becomes recklessness. And the real entailment of those virtues is to recognize that the opposite of courage is not cowardliness, or there is an opposite, but that's only one opposite. So if you think that cowardliness is the only alternative to courage, you are always going to be using courage. You're going to be like a carpenter with a nail. You're going to keep hitting that same nail, and eventually that courage is going to become recklessness, because what you failed to equally appreciate is the value of prudence and deliberateness. Or if you overuse honesty because you don't want to be dishonest, that's the opposite you think of honesty, then what happens is you move toward cruelty and you don't equally value compassion and care, which are a balancing mechanism for honesty. So the idea is not to be honest or to be compassionate all the time. It's to find a way to integrate and equally value, often in paradoxical and nuanced and challenging and subtle situations, the interplay of honesty and compassion, or of confidence and humility, or of courage and prudence. So really, that to me is what development is ultimately all about. It's about seeing more and excluding less. It's about what Zorba the Greek called embracing the full catastrophe. Mm-hmm. You are all of these things. You are the person who overuses your strength. You're the honest person who sometimes is cruel. You're the honest person who, though you've disowned dishonesty, is also got dishonesty in him. And you're the honest person who also tempers it with compassion. Mm-hmm. That's a whole human being. A whole human being is somebody who embraces all of that. And then by seeing it, because you can't change what you don't notice, is able to make choices and decisions about how to behave in the context of this very complex set of feelings that roil through all of us.
Beautiful. What a fantastic way to wrap up those words of wisdom, Tony. Where can people find more about you and the amazing work that you're doing?
Yeah, just simply The Energy Project or theenergyproject.com.
Thank you for joining us today. We have many more exciting thought leaders to come on this show. If you enjoyed this interview, please click the like button and also subscribe so that you can stay tuned to learn from other powerful thought leaders in future shows. We would also appreciate your comments and feedback on the show, as well as who else you would like to hear from. And don't forget to visit our site, IGEOS.net, to download the free worksheet on the 5 disciplines of a high-performance team. See you next time.